I'm a female, and I was in my 20s when I moved to Manchester, UK, from a small town nearby. At first, I was excited to make new connections and explore the city with others. However, I quickly learned why some people avoid talking about bus stops. It all started when I was waiting for a bus to work. It was a mild day around 11 a.m. in the city center. As I waited, a short, medium-built man named Craig approached the stand. After the bus failed to turn up, he began making small talk, which quickly escalated once the bus finally arrived. We sat nearby and continued talking. He opened up about a lot of personal things. I'm used to talking openly, so this didn't faze me. As we got off the bus, we exchanged numbers and arranged to meet a week later. The evening we met was nice at first. I told him about a date I had earlier in the week, and he shared some dating disaster stories. We laughed and bonded over our experiences. He asked what type of guys I liked, and I described them, which was not at all like him. He wasn't flirting at that point, and I felt comfortable. As the night progressed, I was ready to go home, but he suggested we go to a late bar as he wanted to show me one of his favorite spots. I was tired, but agreed to go for an hour or two. At the bar, we found seats by the door, away from the dance floor. There were a few other people around since it was a weeknight. As the music got louder, it became hard to talk. I was about to suggest we call it a night when a tall Irishman approached. At first, we thought he worked there until he asked if I wanted to dance. It was weird because I was clearly sitting down, mid-conversation with Craig. I politely declined, and the man slowly walked away. Craig didn't say anything, and about 15 minutes later, he went to the bathroom. The stranger came back and asked why I was with Craig, saying I could do much better. It really annoyed me. I gave him an angry look and told him I was happy and to enjoy his night. The guy was persistent but eventually left when Craig returned. We ignored what happened and Craig continued pouring out his stories. Craig was getting rather drunk, and he started sitting closer, attempting to flirt, and telling me how he would treat me well if we were dating. I told him I wasn't interested romantically. His demeanor suddenly changed. He moved away and stared at the floor. I began to put my coat on, and he asked where I was going. His breath was pungent. I can't explain the odor, but until that point, he hadn't been so close to my face. I could feel the heat from it. I walked outside and urged him to come out too. I told him I appreciated his kindness, but wasn't looking for a romantic relationship. As we walked, he suddenly stopped in the middle of the road, put his hands on his head, and began repeating, "I don't get it." I approached him and apologized if I had given the wrong impression. He began sobbing, saying he was confused because he got on with me better than with anyone else. I told him he'd connect with others if he was as open with them as he was with me. He got close to me again, with his hands on my arms and face close to mine, saying how I should give him a chance. I was angry. I didn't expect to take care of a grown man or have him try to manipulate me into a date. I pulled away and said I'd take him to his bus stop. I didn't want him to know where I lived. His face lit up, and he insisted on taking me to my bus stop. I lied about the bus times, saying his was due and mine was 20 minutes away, but it backfired, and he walked with me. Thankfully, my bus came quickly, and I lied about where I lived. He tried calling me about 10 times that night, and the next day, he left voicemails and messages pleading for a date. It was excessive and intense, so I blocked his number. For the next 3 months, he called me from various numbers, mobile and landlines. I Googled one of them, and it was his work. He was a head chef at a fancy restaurant. After 5 months, I felt at ease until I began working as a promoter at a nightclub. I had been there a few weeks when I went to sign in, and a guy held the door open for me. It was him. I was in shock and shaking, so I went outside and rushed to tell my colleague. She said, "Oh, him. Yeah, he's a promoter too." I told her what happened between us, and she said, "Craig?" That doesn't sound like him. I quickly lied and said, no, I thought it was a different guy. We laughed, but inside I was terrified. Why would a head chef be working a minimum wage job standing outside in the freezing cold handing out flyers? I never returned to that job and deactivated my Facebook account. I never posted where I worked. Fast forward 5 years later, I began working as a host at a cocktail bar. When I looked at the interview sheet, I saw his name. The job he applied for was in the kitchen, not head chef wage. The interviews were over 3 days, and I was there to greet everyone. He never showed up, and someone else was hired. Thankfully, it's been nearly 10 years now, and I haven't heard from him since. I've had other experiences with stalkers and learned to be careful with who I make friends with, whether through work or small talk at a bus stop. Stalkers are all around us. I was in college when this happened, and it was my second year. I was still living with my parents back then, but hardly spent any time at home. My best friend, Heather, lived near the school in a shared apartment, and we would hang out at her place a lot and spend the night there a few times a week. Usually, she and I had a lot of classes together early in the week, so we were basically inseparable at that time. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and we were in between classes, just hanging out around the library. There were some outdoor picnic tables there. We were just sitting around talking. We had a class coming up in about half an hour, so we weren't doing much. Then a man approached us. He looked much older than most students, maybe in his 30s. His clothes were shabby, and his hair was greasy. He didn't look like a student at all, and I'm sure Heather noticed that too. He began flirting with Heather, but in a really sarcastic way. Not sure what kind of charm he was going for, but it really wasn't working. Heather tried to shut him down, but the man didn't take no for an answer. He kept asking, and his tone became more aggressive. The two of us were sitting there at that picnic table while the man stood over us with his hands pressed down on the top of the table. He was leaning in on us in a foreboding way. We leaned back to get a few extra inches of distance from him. My friend and I awkwardly looked at each other, neither of us sure what to do. Heather remained calm and kept saying no to the guy, but eventually, he began to get angry. His face turned red, and he raised his voice, accusing her of being rude. We were both getting uncomfortable, and I could see the fear in Heather's eyes. We decided to leave the area and headed toward the building where our class was. As we walked, I noticed the man was following us at a distance. He was behind us the whole way to the building, but when we went inside, he didn't come in. After we were done with class, we decided to head to Heather's apartment because we were done for the day. It was walking distance from the school, so we were on the sidewalk leaving campus. At one point, Heather looked back and then told me to look. The guy was following us. When we reached the apartment building, we went inside and made sure he didn't get in. He was far enough back by then, and our building was really big, so we weren't overly worried about him seeing us. A lot of students lived there, and he probably could have guessed where we were going just by the odds. Her place was on the 7th floor. When we got up, we looked out the window, and he was still there lurking nearby. We made dinner and watched some TV shows. The next time we looked out the window, I couldn't see him. It didn't mean he wasn't there somewhere, but I didn't see him. I stayed the night that time, partly because I didn't want to go out, but it was something we would do anyway, a lot of the time. A few days later, Heather called me and sounded frantic. She told me the same man had followed her again. This time, he was in his car. She had seen him parked outside one of the buildings where she had class, and then noticed him trailing her as she walked to the next one. Heather tried to take a different route, hoping to lose him, but he stayed on her tail. She even took a few random turns and went down some other streets, but he didn't give up. I think he was trying to learn her schedule, maybe to make stalking easier in the future. When she went into the building again, he didn't follow. It scared her, though, and she didn't know what to do. I could hear the worry in her voice, and it made me anxious too. I didn't know why he went after her instead of me, but I was also worried that I was being followed without realizing it. We decided we should report it to campus security. Heather went to their office the next day and explained everything. They took down her information but said there wasn't much they could do without more concrete evidence. They promised to keep an eye out, but that didn't make us feel much safer. Around that time, we began to make plans to ensure that neither of us was alone on campus as much as possible. I told her that they should be able to find the guy because there were cameras everywhere. I guess they couldn't prove anything nefarious that way. One evening, Heather called me again in a panic. She had seen the man again while she was leaving a study group. This time, he had followed her all the way to her apartment building again and parked nearby. She waited inside alone for a long time, hoping he would leave. When he didn't, she called me. I told her to stay put and that I would come over because I was still at the school. As I approached the building, I saw the man's car parked outside. He was sitting in the driver's seat, staring at the entrance. As I approached the apartment building door, I called Heather to buzz me up, but she didn't answer right away. As I stood outside the building, I looked back and saw the man was out of his car and walking toward me. I wanted to run, but he was already too close, and I was afraid that if I ran, he would catch me. Instead, I tried to play it cool as he approached. When he walked up to me, I smiled politely and then looked away. He stood next to me in front of the door, but didn't say a word. I texted Heather quickly to let her know not to open the door and let him in. After standing near the guy for about 30 seconds, I was feeling more relaxed because he hadn't tried anything yet. Then I got a message from my friend. She told me to meet her at the back door on the other side of the building. I quietly slipped away and began walking around. I looked back, and he wasn't there, so I continued. As soon as I turned the last corner, I saw the door. When I got there, I stood and waited. It seemed long, but Heather finally opened it from the inside. Not more than a second later, the man ran out from around the corner and was heading right for us. I slipped in, and we slammed the door behind us. Heather didn't even see him, but I told her what happened. That night we talked and decided that we had to do something. The next day, we met with security again, and this time we were more assertive. They seemed to take us a little more seriously, and they told us they would keep in touch with updates. When we left the meeting, Heather and I agreed that we would call the police if they didn't do anything within a week. A few days later, Heather got a call from campus security. They informed her that the man had been identified and issued a warning to stay off campus because he wasn't even a student. Hearing this was a huge relief for both of us, but we were still worried for a while. We never saw the man again, though, and occasionally Heather would mention how those few weeks had terrified her to the core. I felt the same way even though she seemed to be the real target. In the end, the experience brought us closer together. It was a tough period, but we got through it by looking out for each other. My name is Alice, and this happened a long time ago when I was in high school, in grade 11. I'm 40 now, so it was decades ago. I'm from a small town of around 50,000 people, and I went to one of the 2 high schools in the town. One of them was really big and pretty modern, but I went to the old one that was small. Most of my friends went there as well, so I was okay with it. The thing about the smaller school was that there were really only a few groups of friends there, so if anything happened with one of them, you really couldn't get away from it. This story is basically about when I got stalked by a guy who went to my school. His name was Ben, and he was in my year, so we had a lot of classes together. I thought he was pretty normal at first, because he seemed to get along well with the other guys. Even though he had just moved there recently, you might even say that he was popular. It all started out at school, but it eventually went much further than that. One time, he came up to me at lunch and pulled me aside in the hallway. At this point, I hardly knew him, we had talked once or twice. As soon as we were alone in a dark corner of the hallway, he asked me if I wanted to see something. Not knowing what to expect, I said yes. Ben took his backpack off his back, put it on the floor in front of him, and unzipped it from the top. Inside, it was completely filled with textbooks from our history class. I looked down, feeling confused, and looked back at him. He had this proud look on his face, as if I should be impressed, and he told me he was going to burn them later. I smiled awkwardly and then walked away. I wasn't going to tell anybody because that's not my style, but I certainly wasn't impressed. He stole all the books from one of the rooms. Big deal, I thought. Sure enough, the next time I was in class, the teacher couldn't find the books, so she handed out a bunch of photocopies instead so we could do the lesson. Ben leaned over and looked at me, giving me a smug smile. That was when I decided that I really didn't like him. Maybe a month later, one of my friends was having a party at his house. Most of our class was invited, as well as some people from the other high school. His parents were away, so there was some drinking. Things never got that crazy, because it wasn't our style. People were up and dancing though, and we were having a good time. I didn't think Ben was going to be there because it was already 10 at night, but then he walked in the door with another guy from our school. As soon as Ben was in the room, I could feel him looking at me. Every time I caught him out of the corner of my eye, he was staring right at me. But I tried to avoid him for the whole night. When it was around 1 a.m., the party was winding down and I was thinking of leaving. I called my older brother for a ride, but he told me that it'd be about an hour before he could make it. My other option would have been to call my parents and risk getting in trouble, so I decided to wait. Some people were staying over, so it was fine for me to stay a while longer. When I was talking to one of my other friends, Ben overheard me saying that I was waiting for a ride. He stumbled over and offered to drive me home, but I could tell that he was drunk. I was still pretty sober, so I was nowhere near stupid enough to go with him. I asked his friend if he was really going to drive, but he just shrugged. When I refused to go, Ben was persistent and tried to talk me into going with him. At one point, he even grabbed my arm and tried to drag me out the door. I pulled back and got my arm free, then got away from him. I took a few good steps back into the house, away from Ben. Then he came at me with an angry look in his eyes. I screamed loudly, and a few people turned around. When Ben realized that, he backed off and left. I ended up waiting for my brother, who got there around 2 a.m. He was working late at the time, and his work was not far away, so it was no problem for him to get me. On the way home, I didn't bother to tell him what happened at the party, and when we got back to our house, our parents were already asleep. At school the next week, I told some of my friends that Ben was creeping me out. Word spread around school that I felt that way, and eventually Ben heard. He came up to me outside one day when I was walking to the bus. He was really angry and getting in my face, almost like we were about to fight. Luckily, there were some other people around, so I walked faster until I was close enough to some of them. By that point, it felt like I had a full-on stalker. It was like he was always around me when I was at school, and I was even seeing him in my neighborhood, even though he didn't live that close. That worried me, because he knew where I lived. Another time, my parents were away for the weekend, so my brother and I were home alone. On Friday night, I stayed in and watched some movies with my brother and one of his friends. But on Saturday, my brother had to work. He was working at a gas station back then and didn't get off until around 2 in the morning, usually. That night, I had some friends over. We watched a movie and hung out mostly, but they all went home before midnight. About 10 minutes after they were gone, one of my friends called me. She told me that when they were driving home, she saw a man walking around near my house a few blocks away, but headed in my direction. I knew right away that he was coming for me. I checked all the doors to make sure they were locked, then I closed the curtains on all the windows that had them. But as soon as I was done, I heard the doorbell ring. It was one of the most disturbing sounds I've ever heard. Hoping it was a mistake, I went to the front window and looked through the small gap in the curtains. It was indeed Ben standing on my porch. Since I knew the door was locked, it seemed best to ignore him. I went to the other room to wait, but then I heard him banging on the door. After a few long minutes, it seemed like he wasn't going to give up. I then heard the absolute most terrifying noise of my life. The door unlocked and creaked open. Ben had a key somehow. I looked around the corner and saw Ben walk in. I think he saw me too. As soon as I laid eyes on him, I knew he was messed up on something. Maybe he was just drunk. I ran out the back of the house into the backyard. There was a fence around the yard, and I didn't want to be trapped, so I went around the side where there was a row of bushes. I hid behind it, knowing that if he found me, I would have a way to escape. Remember, this was the early 2000s, and I didn't have a cell phone yet. I stayed quiet and waited for a long time, maybe over an hour, until a car drove by. So I jumped out. It was actually my brother coming home from work. I told him what happened, but he could hardly believe me. When we went into the house, there was nobody there. My brother called the cops for me. They came to check out the house. I told them that I knew the guy who broke in, so they went over to his place to check on him. It was the middle of the night though, so when they got to his house, his parents were asleep. That night, I stayed up with my brother because I was too scared that Ben would come back. While we were up, we talked pretty much the whole time. I told him that Ben had managed to unlock the door from the outside, meaning that he had a key somehow. To this day, I don't know for sure, but I think he broke in and stole one. Maybe he had a copy made and put the original back. Either way, that creep had a key to my house, and I couldn't relax at all. When the police finally caught up with Ben, he denied the whole thing. And I couldn't prove that he was actually there. My parents believed me though, and they changed the locks as soon as they got back. I had to see Ben around at school until we graduated, but not much else happened. Maybe the police scared him and he backed off. I was always creeped out when I saw him though, and it was a big cause of stress in my life. I didn't go to any parties or gatherings if Ben or one of his friends was going to be there. That meant that I missed out on some things. It was all worth it though, to be away from him. I've worked as a DJ at various radio stations throughout my life. It's been a fun and interesting career, and an enjoyable experience for the most part. Of course, as with any job, it has its weird moments. I don't drive a car. I live in a small city and walk everywhere. I don't normally speak to random strange men, but one day I saw a guy walking two black Scotty dogs on leashes. I was interested in the dogs, so without thinking, I asked him if they were friendly. Their owner said yes, and that it was okay for me to pet them. It turns out the dogs weren't the only friendly ones. The guy, whose name turned out to be Jerry, was also friendly. He asked me for my phone number. I don't consider myself a pretty woman, so he caught me off guard. Jerry was a fairly good-looking guy. He looked to be about my age, so I don't know why I was so hesitant. Maybe I had an instinct that something was off about him. I lied and told him that I was in between cell phones at the moment, but I did let him know how to find me on Facebook. In hindsight, I know that was a stupid mistake. I gave my work info right on the homepage. Now that he knew where I worked, he began showing up with his dogs in the parking lot outside the radio station at the end of my shift. Day after day, he asked me for a date, and I declined every time. I'd just gotten out of a couple of bad relationships, and I needed a break. Jerry may not have had my personal number, but he was able to call me on the radio station's hotline. It was so stressful. I never knew when I answered the phone if it was going to be an innocent listener with a song request or Jerry imploring me to give him a chance, asking, "What don't you like about me?" One day, Jerry crossed the line. He tried to follow me home. Block after block, he pursued me, calling out, "You're gonna talk to me. Stop running." I had been walking really fast up until that point, but then I broke into a sprint. I ran through people's yards, finally hiding behind a church. I caught sight of Jerry and his dogs, but fortunately, they didn't spot me. I could see the frustration and anger on his face as he realized he lost me. My heart was still pounding when I got home, and I called the police. I took out an order of protection against him. The shocking thing was that the cops had heard of Jerry. He had stalked a couple of women prior to me, and the police had to get involved both times. Luckily, that did the trick. Jerry left me alone from then on. I haven't seen him or those unique-looking dogs in years. So maybe they left the area, or maybe he's in jail. Who knows?